Hello, this is David Brown, and I work at Dalton State College, and I want to talk to you today about some of the genealogy and local history resources we have for the Dalton region. One of the best resources we have can be found in Galileo. There's a really nice database called Ancestry Library Edition, and it's very different than Ancestry.com. It's a lot more to offer. So I hope you use that to search for your information on your ancestors. And it's also a great source for local history because it's tied into a lot of local collections databases. There's a lot to we have in the at Dalton State Library. One of the best resources is a documentary produced by Dalton State faculty. It's called The History of Catoosa County. We also have the Whitfield Murray Historical Society newsletters dating back many years. Um, we have Galileo, which has lots of databases. We'll talk about the Slave Voyage database if you're looking for ancestors tracing to Africa. We have a whole lot of books on genealogy and local history. Government documents, which is a large section downstairs and some online. The Bandy Heritage Center, which is also at the first floor of the library. And Whitfield Murray Historical Society is just a couple of ways from campus, and they offer a lot of resources as well. The website I'm going to talk about is libguides.daltonstate.edu/genealogy, and that's got all this information. So I hope you'll take a look at that. It's got links to all of these sources you're seeing on your screen. So, including the local resources such as the Murray County Museum, which has put all of their data online, which is this is a wonderful resource if you're looking at Murray County history, especially. There's a lot of other stuff besides just the databases like Ancestry. We have census records here in in Dalton State Library. There's some online sources like findagrave.com that literally has just about every cemetery in America and who's buried there. Don't forget church records when you're looking at local history. If you know where the person worked that you're researching, you can look at their work employee records. Newspapers have a lot of information, and Galileo has a great database called um, Access News World Bank or Access World Bank for newspapers. There's also newspapers.com, but newspapers.com is something you have to pay for, but it's pretty good as well. Don't forget city directories, and we have a lot of city directories here in the library at Dalton State, and you always want to look at city directories to find out where your ancestors live or whoever you're researching. Town histories is important. It's important to have some kind of knowledge of history to know which towns to research. For example, in the Dalton area, there was a large city called Spring Place, relatively large, that is, and it was actually larger than Dalton, Georgia at one time. It's located right near west where Chatsworth, Georgia is today. So looking up town histories is an important thing to do for your research. And Facebook groups like the Georgia genealogy page, the Tennessee genealogy page. Local counties have Facebook groups, and that is certainly a good idea to um, use for research. The other thing to know about doing local history and genealogy is there are a lot of digitized recordings you can search on YouTube, and you can make your own digitized recordings. And I have um, instructions on how to do that at the LibGuide, the web page I showed you earlier. You can also use facial recognition now. I've got a web page here you can look at. This is linked to from the LibGuide web page I showed you. You can actually do facial recognition. If you find a picture and you're not sure which ancestor it is, you can use a technique here and to determine who it is in the picture and see if it's really your ancestor. And this is an image from findagrave.com. So findagrave.com is free, and it will not only have pictures of the cemetery, but oftentimes it has pictures of the person you're researching as well, and links to their ancestors. Dalton has a very unique history, and a lot of this happened all within a couple of miles of Dalton State campus. And this is a great place to do your research, the campus of Dalton State. The Cherokee were a big part here, and we'll look at a timeline here in a second. African American population was here in Dalton. The Scotch Irish had a huge impact, and later on, Latinos, Arabs, Jews, and Germans. There's an area in Dalton called Germantown that we'll talk about that's changed names now. And so the first part of history brought in a lot of people like the Scotch Irish and African Americans, and of course before that the Cherokee. Later on came the carpet industry, which brought in Latinos, and a variety of Asian, Arab, and Jewish folks. So it's very interesting history, and all within a few miles of campus. There's so much around here. Fort Hill, which we'll talk about in a second, an incredible site where a handful of about 700 African American soldiers fought off 20,000 Confederate soldiers. The Great Snowball Fight was right here near campus. The Disney Civil War grave is 1 mile up from campus to the top of the mountain to our west. The place where the Cherokee played their ball game, Emory Center. There's a Jewish synagogue, a mosque, the 1840s German colony site, all within just a couple of miles of our campus. So doing research on history or genealogy, you should definitely know a timeline of events. And it's important to know that of course, indigenous Native American people came over thousands of years ago. The Cherokee were the Native Americans in this region, but they came along more recently in the last few hundred years. Before the Cherokee, if you're interested, you can. There's Indian Mounds area, Etowah Indian Mounds, that would be a group that was here before the Cherokee, if you're interested in that. Not too far from Dalton. The Scotch Irish, a better word for them would be the Ulster Scots. They came from a tiny area of Northern Ireland. Before that, they were from Scotland. And this is important to know, though. This started an event that led to a massive exodus of Scots Irish from Northern Ireland in the 16 and 1700s. We'll talk about that in a second. Another big event in Dalton region history would be, of course, slavery. And we have a couple of databases in Galileo if you're researching slaves. We have a new slave voyage database I'll talk to you about in a second that lists individual people on slave ships and all kind of information about them. Later in history, the Cherokee were defeated, and that happened in the 1700s. Then there was a very important part of history where Cherokee mixed with some of the Scotch Irish that were here in the early 1800s, and that had a big impact on genealogy because almost everyone in North Georgia and East Tennessee have a story about a Cherokee ancestor, and this is probably when it happened. But gold was discovered in Dalton, or east of Dalton in the northeast Georgia area, and then you had the Trail of Tears, unfortunately, where thousands of Cherokee were forcibly marched to eastern Oklahoma. And a lot of people have Cherokee ancestors that are living there today. There are 2 Cherokee reservations, one in eastern Oklahoma and one in western North Carolina. We'll talk about those. And the Civil War, of course, was huge. And the National Park Service has a really nice Civil War soldiers database we'll talk about. That's a great place to look for your Civil War ancestor. And, of course, Jim Crow era. This was a time in history after the Civil War and before the Civil Rights Movement that saw a lot of segregation between blacks and whites in the Dalton area. And it's also an interesting time where a lot of atrocities were committed against blacks in this area by groups like the Ku Klux Klan. And you can learn a lot about that in the historical newsletters, like the Whitfield Murray County newsletter we have here at Dalton State. And finally, a huge event, the beginning of the tufted bedspread industry led to the Dalton becoming the carpet capital of the world. And Catherine Evans Whitener is a very important person. She never really became as wealthy as some others, but she really got this started with her bedspread industry. Um, and once Dalton became the carpet capital of the world, there was a new immigration pattern um, that involved people coming from all over the world. We'll talk about that. And there's a picture of her, Catherine Evans Whitener. So one of the best things you can do if you're studying genealogy or really even local history is to do the DNA test. And you can do this through Ancestry. So now, if you want to do the DNA test, you actually have to do that through Ancestry, the website. We do have a free access to Ancestry Library Edition um, through Galileo, but you can go to Ancestry.com and activate a DNA test. And they'll send you a sample. You basically spit into it, you send it back, and it will tell you not only your regional history, and this is mine that I've shared, um, your DNA communities, but this test will also tell where you came from. And a lot of people of European ancestry have a lot of Scottish ancestry if you're from North Georgia or East Tennessee. Um, let me go. Let's see. So the other advantages is when you do this test, this will tell you not only where your DNA matches you to, but you will get a list of several hundred people who are related to you. And I've blacked out who these people are on this screen, but this is what's really great about doing this Ancestry DNA test. And we'll talk about another one. There's 23andMe and MyHeritage that does a similar one. But you can then link on their family tree, and trace all the way back to as far as they have. Then you can start your own tree, and it will use a fairly complex algorithm and determine who your ancestors were. And I'll give you an example. I was able to trace my family tree pretty quickly back to the 1500s with this ancestry. So I hope that you'll take advantage of that. And this is just part of mine. So, and I've gone way further back than this. So this is easily done if you do the DNA, if you pay for the ancestry. Now, I've done the DNA test and you get some of this, but if you want to keep going way back over on this side, you can pay a monthly charge and Ancestry will trace it back to as far back as you want to go. Also, the Ancestry DNA test shows where your relatives are located that are also did the DNA test, and it matches you. And I have a lot in the southern Appalachians and in eastern Oklahoma, but I have some all over the country. So certainly interesting to do this DNA test. And I'm talking about Ancestry DNA, but 23andMe has one. The 23andMe focuses more on your ethnicity. This is not mine. This is something someone shared online, but it will look at this thing called chromosome view. And if you're more interested on what ethnicity you are, if you have African American or Native American, um, whatever you're interested in, this will show you even more so than Ancestry will. So it's 23andMe is another good idea. So real quick look at our local history resources. We have a lot of books on the Scotch Irish, and they came from Scotland, and they started out in Scotland. Most of them went to Northern Ireland and in what was called the Great Plantation, and that was where the King of England pushed these people to go to settle in Northern Ireland to keep the Catholics under control. Most of the people in Scotland were Presbyterian. So they went first here to Northern Ireland and a place called Ulster, and it wasn't too great here. So they left there and came to America in the 1700s. And this is a very important area if you have Scottish ancestry, which a lot of people in this area do. Um, because it's important to understand this conflict before you can fully understand why these people came here to the Southern Appalachians. Later, the same conflict resulted in a time called the Troubles in Northern Ireland as recently as the late 1900s. I have some videos you can watch about the Scotch Irish and the Southern Appalachians. I encourage you to do that. It's on the website I showed you earlier. But there are a lot of Scotch Irish in this area. George Bush, Johnny Cash, Loretta Lynn, Dolly Parton, Billy Graham, Andrew Jackson. That's just to name a few, but I encourage you to go and watch this video. Um, Now, if your ancestors were Scotch Irish, they probably followed this route. They came in through Delaware, Pennsylvania area on a ship, and then they came down this great wagon road here, and they either split and came through East Tennessee, or they came down North Carolina through South Carolina. And my ancestors, about half of them went down this way, down the Wilderness Road, and the other half went down through North Carolina, South Carolina, and came in from South Carolina through North Georgia. Today, the Scotch Irish can be found mostly in the Southern Appalachians, Central Appalachians, and into Eastern Texas and the Ozarks of Arkansas. There's a lot of information about the Scotch Irish in this area. I mentioned a documentary by Kim Correll, who's a faculty member at Dalton State. And if you want to learn more, there's a great little stone church near Ringgold called the Old Stone Church Museum. And it's got not only information about the Scotch Irish, but inside this church you can see bloodstained floors where it was a hospital used to treat Civil War soldiers. In the Civil War, you can also see the pews where 160 years ago during the Civil War, the soldiers' horses used these pews to eat out of. The pews were, I believe, brought outside. So it's quite a place to go look at. Now, we mentioned the Cherokee. They're an important part of local history and genealogy. This is how much of an area they used to have way back in the 1600s. And this is what it got dwindled down to. And finally, the Trail of Tears, they were forced to go into eastern Oklahoma, and they left their native lands here. And now there's a reservation in Cherokee, North Carolina, and one in eastern Oklahoma. There are a lot of famous Cherokee, and we have a lot of books in our library you can check out to learn more about these people. A lot of these people were a mix of Scotch Irish and Cherokee. John Ross, for example, and Chief Fan had a lot of Scotch Irish and Cherokee blood. Nancy Ward and Dragon Canoe were two related Cherokee, and Nancy was the peacemaker and Dragon Canoe was the warrior. And it's a fascinating story. We have books about them. And I encourage you to travel to Cherokee, North Carolina if you want to learn more, or look at some of the historical sites we have around Dalton. There's a great musical in Cherokee, North Carolina called Unto These Hills. And I have resources on the website I showed you earlier. If you think you're Cherokee, I've got this video you can go watch. And it's a short little video, and it can help you determine your Cherokee ancestors, who they were. Like a lot of people locally, I have Cherokee ancestors, and I was able to find a lot about them through a new website called fold3.com. We'll talk about here in a second. So we have a lot of resources in the library. I've got a couple of videos I've put online. There's a website called CherokeeHeritage.org, but we also have a book called Cherokee Connections that's specifically for people researching to find out if they are Cherokee or not. If you have ancestors from Africa and you're interested in searching that, I highly recommend the DNA test. The DNA test will show pretty much the last few generations if you have any African DNA in you, and it will trace on this left side where in Africa you're from, and on the right side you see it will trace where your ancestors are in the United States. So if you were related to slaves that came over in the 1700s from Africa, and then your ancestors landed here, were brought and worked on plantations, If some of your descendants moved to Chicago, for example, this will show that and who they are if they did a DNA test. So it's a really good thing to do if you're interested in tracing your African ancestors. We also have a great database in Galileo called Slave Voyages, and it is just really tremendous. It has lists of thousands of people who came over on slave ships, and it has their name, where they came from, where they started, and where they ended up. So definitely want to take a look at that. Whether even if you're not looking at ancestors and if you're just interested in history, this is one of the best databases we have in Galileo. Um, you can also get to this online. It's called I think it's slavevoyages.org, but we have more access in Galileo. There's a whole lot of local history with the African American population we have in Dalton, and I hope you'll go on the LibGuide and learn more details. But this was a famous picture. Mr. Pryor was on the left here. Uh, just to give you a touch on a small amount of this history, he was a slave who escaped from a plantation southwest of Dalton. He went to Chattanooga, joined the 44th U.S. Colored Troops, came back to Dalton, fought in Fort Hill, the Battle of Fort Hill. They were at that battle. You can learn more about this in the LibGuide, but they were outnumbered 20,000 people to 700 people. And of course, they had to surrender and they were forced back into slavery. Him and the rest of this 44th Colored Troops. It's a sad story, but certainly one of the many great stories of local history here. This article on the right's a little blurry, but it was from the Whitfield Murray Historical Newsletter. And we have editions of this going way back to the many years. And I hope you'll look at these because it is loaded with information such as the Jim Crow era, the schools, frequently naming some individuals in pictures. And you certainly want to look at this. We have it at the Dalton State Library, copies of this. It's definitely worth looking at. If you're looking to research more about your ancestors, the freedmensbureau.com has some great resources, as does this PBS website. I've linked to these from the LibGuide, so I hope you'll take a look at those. And the Emory Center is a awesome place. It is here near campus, about a mile east of campus, and it traces the African American history of Dalton. If you're interested in learning about Latino immigration in Dalton, this book you're seeing a cover of is just a tremendous resource. It traces back the early families who came into Dalton and who were Latino, many of them coming from Mexico and Central America. And it's a fascinating book that talks about their journeys. And you certainly want to check that out if you're interested in that, if you have relatives who were some of these folks. And you can do the DNA test as well. I have some information about that on the LibGuide. And this is a sample DNA test from this particular person. Was actually from Mexico, and they made their DNA test public. And it was interesting because it shows a lot more Native American category than you would see compared with European folks looking at their DNA ancestry. So, and then there's Spain and Portugal. It's really interesting, though, to see that. So, and I have more resources if you're Latino and you're interested in genealogy. The other thing a lot of people don't know is there was a fairly large Jewish population in Dalton from the 60s to the 80s. And I have an article. You can look at this more in detail on the website. But it details who the families were. So if you're interested in researching your genealogy and the Jewish side of your family, you definitely want to look at my LibGuide. This Jewish population lived throughout Dalton, and the synagogue was east of Dalton campus, about a mile east of here. So you certainly want to look at the LibGuide webpage to learn more about information about that. Um, there was even a German colony in Dalton that dates way back to the 1840s, and this area is now called Crown Mill Village. And if you have German ancestors and you are from this area, you definitely want to look at the history of this place. They're just some of the names. And a lot of these people were fleeing Germany in the 1840s from the turmoil there, religious turmoil. So Dalton's has a very interesting history. And like I was talking about earlier, when we became carpet capital of the world, we brought in all kind of interesting families. And one of the most interesting is Shaheen Shaheen. He was president of World Carpet, and he's written a great book that we have in the library about the first years of the World Carpet and the carpet industry in Dalton. And he has an interesting family history, like a lot of folks who came in during the 1900s. His ancestors can be traced back to the West Bank, Palestine area, near a city called Ramallah. His wife is interesting. Her ancestors were Italian, and she was actually a war hero in World War II, working underground in Italy against the Nazis. And if you want to read more about them, you can look at the website I have on the LibGuide. They definitely have fascinating family histories. But the Appalachian Mountains, this area is really interesting. I hope you'll come and learn more in the library or visit your local North Georgia Library, public library. There's a lot of interesting stories about the Appalachians. The Blue people of Appalachia were actually a little north of Dalton, but some of their descendants came into this area. The Fugate family came in down through East Tennessee into North Georgia. The blue color of skin, though, was more in Eastern Kentucky, but it's in Western Virginia. But it's still a very interesting story when you have such an isolated area. And the other interesting local history are the Melungeons. They were a little north of here in East Tennessee, but some of the people here are descended from them. And we have a lot of books on them in Dalton Library. A lot of people are interested in them, and they were a big mystery. If you don't know about them, you can look at the website. But they date back, they're an Appalachian group way back to the 1600s. And DNA showed that they are descendants of white and black indentured servants who mixed together in the 1600s before slavery was widespread. You actually have black and white indentured servants in the short time in history. And of course, their descendants were not tolerated, and there's a lot of discrimination against them. So they moved to the mountains of East Tennessee, and they're made for a fascinating story. And some of their descendants came down to this area later, but it certainly makes for a fascinating story. And we have lots of books on that and lots of links on the library website I showed you. So I encourage you to do the DNA test. There's more than one. There's Ancestry, 23andMe, and MyHeritage. Ancestry is probably the best to trace your ancestors. 23andMe is best for if you want to see your genetic makeup. And I have a video showing you how to do it. But the whole process just takes a few weeks. The spitting is really quick. You mail it in, and then you monitor your progress. They send you email updates, and then you get your test results back, and they're always exciting to see. So just one last thing. If you have a dog and you want to see their history, you can go to embarkvet.com and do a DNA test, and it'll show you not only on the left side here what kind of dog they are, but on the right side, it'll show you who they're related to. So you can trace your dog back. Well, that's the end. Thank you for listening. There's the website again, libguides.daltonstate.edu/genealogy. And so I'm going to leave that up there for a few seconds. My email is dobrown@daltonstate.edu. And David Brown is my name. I work at Dalton State. My office is in the library. And I would be happy to help you out with genealogy if you have any questions. So thank you again for listening in, and good luck with your research.